Welcome to another LSE IDEAS Russia-Ukraine Dialogue. Our dialogues take place every Tuesday. Beyond most expectations, Ukrainian soldiers continue to hold out in Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol, the last holdout of Ukrainian resistance in the city. Meanwhile, Russia's main military efforts are largely concentrated in Eastern Ukraine. Putin's victory speech arguably signaled that the Kremlin will maintain rather than escalate or de-escalate its current level of resources in the war. Since the 29th of March, Ukraine and Russia have not held face-to-face peace talks, although the adversaries have met since then via video calls. On the diplomatic front, we've seen a variety of Western officials visiting Kiev over the past few days and weeks, including Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. Yesterday, President Biden signaled a historic bill into law that will expedite the process of sending military aid to Ukraine. Today, the US Congress is also set to debate a nearly $40 billion military package for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Hungary continues to hold hostage the EU Commission's initiative on sanctions against Russia. Now, since February, nearly 13 million Ukrainians have been displaced, either internally or as refugees, as a result of Putin's military aggression in Ukraine. Again, as I've said previously on these dialogues, that represents the entire population of countries like Belgium and South Sudan. Now that brings us to the dialogue for today, which will focus on the humanitarian impact of this conflict. And it is my pleasure to welcome three very distinguished panelists. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Maria Avdeeva. She's the research director of the European Expert Association. Now, under normal circumstances, she focuses on international security, cooperation of Ukraine with the EU and NATO in combating hybrid threats and emergency security challenges. However, these are not normal circumstances by any measure. Those of you who are not yet following Maria on Twitter should know that she's a hero. She goes out every day all over Kharkiv, which is a Ukrainian city located merely 40 kilometers from the Russian border, to talk to ordinary citizens and their experiences during this war. She also inspects Russian bombings of buildings and residential areas. Maria, you are as brave as your fellow countrymen and women who are fighting Russian troops with guns and RPGs. Your reports of events on the ground help us to help to counter false Russian narratives about the conflict. And that said, it's a great honor for me to welcome you to our dialogues. Welcome, Maria. Michael Young, I'd like to introduce you. He is Mercy Corps' Ukraine Response Director, overseeing its crisis response work in Ukraine, Poland, Romania, and Moldova. He has worked with conflict-affected and displaced people for over 25 years, from resettling Bosnian refugees in the UK to working in the North Caucasus region of Russia. My third and final speaker is Bertrand Blanc, Senior Emergency Coordinator for UNHCR Moldova. Bertrand has over 15 years of humanitarian experience working for UNHCR, focusing on emergency management in a variety of places, stretching from Venezuela to Myanmar. Thank you all three for joining me. Maria, I'm going to first turn to you, so if you could unmute for me, please. You are in Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second largest city. And as I mentioned before, you're merely 40 kilometers away from Russia's border. Now, several military analysts have described Russia's offensive turning into a war of attrition. Can you please tell us about Kharkiv and describe for us what you've been witnessing since the February escalation, especially with regards to the humanitarian impact? Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Dr. Hartwell, for this warm welcome. And this is a great honor for me to speak to you and the colleagues and all the audience. And I'm really honored and take this possibility with a great respect. I have been staying in the city since the 24th of February, and since that time there was no day when Kharkiv was not shelled by Russian troops. So in the first days of the war, Russian troops have advanced and get to the boundaries of Kharkiv, where they have been stationed for almost 2 months. And they were shelling the city from all kinds of weapons, artillery, tanks, Grads, cruise missiles, everything Russia has was used on the city. And that means that there are some areas in the city that were really heavily damaged or destroyed. These are primarily the residential areas, which was always the main Russian target, and that contradicts fully with the Russian claim that they were only targeting military objects. And also the historical center of Kharkiv was severely damaged, and we don't know if it will be if it will be possible to rebuild it, because these are all buildings that were built at the end of 19th or beginning of the 20th century, and they are historical monuments, and they actually survived Nazi occupation of Kharkiv, but didn't survive this recent Russian aggression. And so speaking about the Putin's goals in this war and why he was using propaganda and the Russian state media to legitimize it, at the first stage of this war, all Russian propaganda and disinformation was aimed at creating this idea that Russia will be able to get control over main Ukrainian cities, including Kharkiv, in a few days. And Kharkiv was the primarily target, as it is the second largest city of Ukraine. And before the war, 1.5 million people were living here, and it is a mostly Russian-speaking city. So Putin was probably counting that Russian troops will be welcomed here. But it never was the case. Never during this period, Russian troops were able to get control over some part of the city. There were several attempts when they tried to get into the city into small military vehicles, but these attacks were fought back, and these troops were eliminated on the spot. And since that time, Russia didn't try, and the attempts were not successful. So they decided that if they cannot take the city by force and take control of the city, so they will be now targeting residential areas, threatening civilians, and not allowing the city to return to its normal life. And that means that now the city is really empty because people are advised not to, those who evacuated are advised not to return to the city until the shelling stops. The situation is now getting a little bit better, because the Ukrainian troops are doing very effective counter-offensive operations, and that means that they have been able to push back Russian troops in the north and east of Kharkiv up to 15-20 kilometers. And this means that Russia is not able to use artillery as much as previously to shell this city, but it still happens, and the attacks continue to be indiscriminate. And it means that anywhere in the city, when people are outside, this can happen. And we've got new and new reports of the people being killed or wounded because of this aggression. And the more territories are deoccupied and liberated, the more we witness war crimes that were committed there, and the more atrocities we see. I have been today to one of these villages that was recently liberated several days ago, and the people there are hardly talking, because when you ask them what they have been going through, they start crying. Because all these 2 months they were hiding in the basements, not possible for them to go out. They didn't have access to any food or the water was a big problem because the electricity for these 2 months was not there, and that means that the pumps didn't work, and so they need to go get the water, and every time it was a high risk of being killed. And they were struggling all this time, and this is actually the first week when they were able to get out of their basements. And especially a crucial situation is for elderly outside of the city and in the city, because very often these elder people are living on the higher top floors, and they are not able physically to go and find the food. I mean, even if the humanitarian centers are giving out the food, it's physically difficult for them to go there, get this food, get up to the higher floors. And that means that the volunteers are doing incredible job in providing food and medical supplies to these elderly people throughout the city. And very often these volunteers, they risk their own lives, because when driving around the city, they themselves become an easy target for Russian attacks. And I know many of them who were wounded just because they were doing this incredible job for these 2 months. If to speak generally about how the situation looks now, it is less dangerous, but still it is very fluid, because we understand that right now Russia concentrates all its military efforts on attack on Donbass, because they are trying to get control over as much territories of Lugansk and Donetsk regions as possible. And one of the supply routes to Donbass for Russian troops goes near Kharkiv. And Ukrainian army, by doing this counteroffensive, are trying to cut the supply routes, and the Russians are fighting back. So the situation is not stable yet, and I think that we will see in the upcoming weeks or months the new phases of this aggression, because Kharkiv has a strategic meaning for Putin himself and for Russia. It was always on the table of the Russian aggression since 2014. And that means that we have to use this time wisely to prepare the city to defend if this another phase of attack happens, and to regroup, get more supplies, get additional reserves, and be prepared to live in a wartime city for the upcoming months, because this will be the threat that will be very close, because as you have rightly mentioned, that the Russian city Belgorod is located only 40 kilometers from the border with Ukraine, and it means that Russian troops that are situated there and that are concentrated near Belgorod at some point might be used against the city itself. Still, for the positive note, it's necessary to mention that the regional officials and the city council are doing great job in trying to clean up the aftermath of the attacks, return city to living as normal as it could be in the circumstances, to maintain the supplies for the shops and the pharmacies, and this gives us the hope that at some point Kharkiv will again return to living as it used to be before the war. At this, I think I should stop and then continue with our further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for the incredible work and observations that you make, and also for reminding us that the people of Kharkiv are largely Russian speakers also, which helps to demystify many of the propaganda coming from the Kremlin. I'd now like to turn to you, Michael Young. Mike, now you have quite a bird's eye view also of the situation across Ukraine. What has been the humanitarian impact of the conflict inside Ukraine, and what are the main challenges of reaching people? Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Hartwell. It's good to be here, and hello, everybody. Yeah, in fact, I mean, Maria's done such a fantastic, vivid, eyewitness description there of the situation around Kharkiv and the impact in that city, its environs. What I actually want to do is just what you said, take a step back, right, and try and understand the broad parameters of the context, the impact, humanitarian impact, and the humanitarian needs. I mean, obviously, this is a major complex emergency, right, with regional, European, global implications. But I'll focus on Ukraine itself. I'm just noting, as I say all of this, right, as Maria's described so vividly, war changes everything, and it changes big things and small things. It changes geopolitics, and it changes, at a personal level. So we're all probably familiar with the headline figures around the Ukraine crisis. UN estimates almost 16 million people as being in humanitarian need as of the start of this month. That's about a third of the pre-war population of Ukraine. And here, just to note that humanitarian aid broadly, right, is only reaching about a third of those 16 million people in need inside the country. And Maria, again, vividly described some of the reasons why it's so difficult sometimes to get aid into besieged communities or other hard-to-reach areas. So of those 16 million humanitarian need, about, as you said in your remarks, Dr. Hartwell, about just over 13 million people displaced by conflict, right? So forced to flee their homes. 5.6 million of them went across Ukraine's borders, neighboring countries, further afield. 7.7 million, the larger part, still within Ukraine, internally displaced. And of course, again, the vast majority of those displaced people, whether across the borders or within Ukraine, are women, are the children, are the elderly, as Maria described as well. And there's some significant fluidity within that population, I think. So just to kind of some highlight examples of that, I mean, 1.5 million people have actually entered or re-entered Ukraine from Poland since the war began in February, and about 500,000 people are reported to have crossed into the Russian Federation. So some kind of mobility still within a kind of large displaced population. And of course, the needs of that population, needs of people, that change according to their circumstances and where they are, right? So obviously the most acute needs, for example, access to really basic survival assistance, food, drinkable water, shelter, healthcare, they're faced most sharply in the areas of active conflict, right? Besieged areas, hard to reach areas, areas around the active front lines. But even in areas with more stability, inside Ukraine, like in the western areas around Lviv, for instance, or among refugee populations, you still, of course, see acute needs. I mean, the simple fact is that people's resources and their coping mechanisms wear out over time, right? They run out of money. They might have had to flee with very little money, very little resources, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, for example, a recent survey of displaced people in one oblast that was recently regained from the Russian forces, they found what you could describe as an affordability crisis. In that about 40% of displaced households, they report they simply couldn't any longer afford the cost of monthly necessities, right? That's food to eat, shelter for the night, drugs to treat chronic conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So wherever you are, there is acute humanitarian need. That the nature of that need changes depending on circumstance. And of course, as Maria has also described, it's a conflict characterized by systematic, consistent breaches of international humanitarian law. I mean, the laws of war, right? Targeting of civilian infrastructure, like schools, hospitals, residential buildings, targeting of civilians themselves, through indiscriminate bombardment, aerial bombardment, or as evidence, sadly, increasingly points to mass killing at an individual level, use of tactics like besiegement. So, I mean, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights estimates over 6,700 civilian casualties as at the start of this month again, which is a certain underestimate, as we all know, given the difficulty of verifying situations in a lot of areas in Ukraine that are experiencing active conflict and ongoing investigations into civilian deaths within other areas, right? So it's a humanitarian space that's characterized by and large by fluidity, by acute survival needs, extremely high levels of violence, of course, and the violence of a nature that's unpredictable, by which I mean that although most of the active front lines and fighting is now concentrated in the east, in the southeast central areas, aerial barrages can happen anywhere, anytime. And we have over 12 million people who are still essentially trapped within hard to reach areas because conflict makes access difficult to impossible in those areas. So it's a context where access for humanitarian aid is a very real, very tough kind of daily challenge, as Maria again spoke to. And most of all, of course, for those people who are themselves trapped behind siege lines or around active frontline areas. And violent conflict's obviously the single biggest humanitarian aid access challenge within Ukraine. Whether that's trying to negotiate access to a besieged community, one in and around the front lines, or in disruption to aid supplies simply getting through. So, for example, targeting of dual-use infrastructure in the country like railways, a tremendous amount of humanitarian aid reaches Ukraine still on the railroads. Complicated by other factors, right? Another target of dual-use infrastructure is fuel supply depots, right? So that's leading to a fuel crisis in the country, particularly around diesel for the trucks that carry humanitarian aid to places in acute need. And, a lot of attention, rightly focused on those communities that are subjected to horrific sieges, and efforts to evacuate civilians via, humanitarian corridors. We've seen how fragile those corridors can be, and highly vulnerable to manipulation and politicization. But let's be clear, kind of the bottom line is the laws of war themselves dictate that civilians are not targeted, right? Full stop. So humanitarian corridors, although a kind of last-ditch necessity, they're not a gift or a given, or should not be a gift or a given within humanitarian space. I think for us at Mercy Corps, all of this translates into a humanitarian response that above all works with and through partnership with civil society organizations in Ukraine, from grassroots groups, the types of groups of volunteers that Maria was describing, through to kind of more structured, bigger regional or national non-governmental organizations. In Ukraine, in Poland, in Romania, wherever we work, it's going to be by and large through partnership. All these countries, Ukraine especially, I think, has a vibrant civil society. Local organizations have been, continue to be, will continue to be the primary first responders to humanitarian needs. And sometimes the kind of brute truth is only our Ukrainian partners can reach some of the more hard to reach communities with life-saving aid, where Mercy Corps as an international organization simply couldn't reach into and deliver that life-saving assistance. So I guess we're emphasizing, first of all, meeting those basic survival needs for people, making sure that as far as is possible, conflict-affected people can make dignified and informed choices about their lives. That means a big emphasis on cash assistance, right? Direct cash assistance, so that where markets are working and public services are being delivered, people can decide for themselves what their priorities are in terms of them meeting their needs. And where it isn't possible, and this largely speaks to the east and the south central areas where there's active conflict, where it isn't possible, where markets and supply chains have essentially been destroyed or conflicts just too pervasive to get out there and get the basics you need. Then we and our Ukrainian partners are prioritizing delivering in-kind assistance, food commodities, medical commodities, etc. I guess, lastly, we're also working to make sure displaced people get access to credible information. That's critical with all of the misinformation and disinformation that circulates. So we're rolling out some information management tools, communication tools that really focus on enabling displaced people to know about what public services are available locally where they are, what their rights are within that context, whether that be in Ukraine or outside Ukraine. And within both the cash assistance and information components, we want to emphasize those groups also who may be particularly marginalized or vulnerable, right? Such as Roma communities, third country nationals fleeing Ukraine, LBT, GQI individuals, all of this set within a context, again, right? Remembering that the vast majority of displaced people are women, children, and the elderly, all of whom face particular vulnerabilities around exploitation, abuse, marginalization. And then the last layer around that is making sure to also address the needs of host communities, right? Who are, coming forward and supporting displaced people and have their own needs for their own resilience, for their own survival. So there's obviously a lot more to say about the impact of the war, not just strictly in humanitarian terms, but obviously that its impact upon markets, upon resilience inside Ukraine, and a spillover effects globally. But I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that gives a bit of a broad overview of the humanitarian impact, and we can revisit other issues later in the discussion, hopefully. Thanks, Dr. Hartwell.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, and please do call me Leon. You've given a really excellent overview of the humanitarian needs and the situation for organizations like the one that you're working with. I want to also thank you for the work that you and your colleagues are doing, because it is still very much a dangerous situation, in trying to negotiate those humanitarian corridors in a situation where the laws of war are not being respected, of course. And thank you also for bringing up this issue of cash assistance. I believe when I was introduced in Cambodia years ago, that it was a very revolutionary idea, this idea of empowering people to make the decision themselves what they need to spend this money on. But it's good to hear that it's an idea that has worked in other places and that you continue to use in places like Ukraine. And I know Bertrand might probably also say something about that, because in Moldova there have been some interesting initiatives with the credit cards also being issued. Now, Bertrand, I'm going to turn to you, and I just want to mention to our audience that last year Moldova accepted, I think, only 86 asylum seekers. However, this year there were nearly 500,000 refugees already who have showed up in Moldova, largely Ukrainians who have crossed into Moldova, of course. Now, to put that into perspective, Moldova's population is only 3 million people, which means that now 1 out of every 6 people in Moldova are Ukrainian. So in short, Moldova hosts more Ukrainian refugees per capita than any other country in Europe. I don't know if that's in the world, but at least in Europe. Now, can you provide us, Bertrand, with an overview of the refugee situation in Moldova, and how has the Moldovan government and maybe also civil society responded to the situation? What's going on? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leon, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today and part of this panel, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about Moldova, which I believe is very much an interesting and remarkable response from the government, civil society, the whole of approach of Moldova. I try to give you some highlights about this. Like you say, almost 500,000 Ukrainian refugee enter into Moldova in the past 2 months and a half. This is, for most part of them, they move onward to the European country union. So it's about 80% of them going to the European Union, but still 20% remained. So by yesterday, we were with 93,000 refugees inside Moldova. And to give a bit of perspective also on these figures, more than 50,000 are children, which is almost 9% of the total children population of Moldova. So it's a quite significant number, and you can already think about the impact on education and also child protection services in the country, for example. The overall response in the country has been led by the government of the Republic of Moldova, which a very interesting world of approach society, with a very strong civil society engaged. Of course, the faith-based organization, but for example, the youth movement in Moldova, like Moldova for Peace, has been very much on the front line of the response from the day one, able to coordinate more than 3,000 volunteering through media social, to Facebook, to provide direct assistance to refugees. So you have a lot of initiative on this kind in Moldova, has been very interesting also for us as humanitarian, as a learning process. And then, of course, this kind of volunteering initiative cannot last for months because it requires time and investment, but it has been very much the core of the response on the beginning. Now, of course, the international solidarity, international presence has been increased in the country. The government, with the support of UNHCR, has been implementing the Refugee Coordination Forum, which is composed of 85 partners, including UN agency, INGO, national NGO, and also private sectors company who have been supporting the response, like some IT company providing connectivity in some of the refugee centers, for example. So the structure now in place is very far from the beginning of March, when everything arrived. We have the first day 7,000 refugees arrived at the border, and then 2 days after 12,000, and then after 25,000, which was quite a massive influx and a significant effort for the government. More capacity on the ground, more operational footprints for the partner, but still a lot of work remains to be done to support the authority. In terms of the overall structure, without entering into too much detail, of course, we're focusing on sectorial approach, so health, education, protection, shelter approach, and all the structure are led by the government with the support of key UN or INGO partners, sometimes also local partners with a strong capacity to provide coordination. The main focus on this emergency response for the first weeks has been in 3 aspects. The first one is what we call the protection on the move. So to ensure that all protection mechanisms are in place for refugees at the border, reception facility, then at the reception center in Chisinau in the capital, and then on one movement toward the European Union. So facilitate safe transportation by bus, by train, and even by airlift with a specific program with the European Commission, IOM and UNHCR, to allow refugees to move from Chisinau directly to some of the main capital in Europe and resettle in this country. So the international solidarity has been present in Moldova, and the protection mechanism for child protection, and I mean Dr. Young also mentioned this, anything about prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, specific needs for people with disability, LGBTI people, elderly people, which also a concern of the current influx of refugees coming into Moldova, has been one of the focus of the partner and of course of UNHCR as a protection agency. The second aspect of the response is everything related to accommodation, which include also access to food and wash facilities. In the country, just to give you some figures, 90% of the refugees are housed within host community or renting flats or housed by a Moldovan family, and the rest are actually supported by what we call the refugee accommodation center, which are collective centers, public buildings that have been rehabilitated to host refugees for a few days or maybe a week until they find a different solution. We have about 90 refugee accommodation centers in the country that have been supported by the international community, all are managed by the government and local authorities. We have put in place some monitoring system to provide, basic humanitarian assistance inside the center, blankets, bed, etc., to upgrade the wash facility and provide oatmeal when it's needed. So this capacity is about 9,000 refugees, more or less. So we reached this 9,000 after the second week of the crisis. Now this is occupation rate is about 40%, but we still have this capacity in case you have additional influx coming in. And then linked to this, and this is why also I was mentioning the 90% in the host community, and then also I think you mentioned this aspect of the host community. We're moving one of the main aspects of the response is the cash assistance. Cash assistance for refugees and cash assistance for the host community. So we have been working with the government and particularly the Minister of Labour and Social Affairs on harmonized the cash assistance, agreed with the main partner like the WFP, the ICRC, UNICEF, IOM, of course ourselves, to provide some kind of standardized cash assistance for refugees, but also for host family. By today, you have 70,000 refugees pre-enrolled into the systems, and 40,000 refugees already received the bank cards. This bank card it's like an ATM credit card, and you can withdraw money to an ATM, you can pay to the supermarket, you can use it inside Moldova. And UNHCR will provide a monthly payment to all refugees registered for the next 5 to 6 months until we find a transitional way that maybe we can discuss a bit later about the exit strategy of the emergency. On the other side, 15 families, Moldovan families that are hosting refugees have been targeted also with voucher and cash assistance, mainly by the World Food Programme, and provide also with a one-off cash assistance, which helps them, to mitigate a bit this the impact of the crisis. So that's three main pillars of the UNHCR response. On addition to this, of course, I have to add anything related to health. On this, with the leadership of the Ministry of Health and WHO, with main NGO like MSF has been on the ground since day one, providing health. The good aspect also of the response in Moldova for the refugees, like refugee access to public services in Moldova without any restrictions. Special measures have been taken from day one by the government, and this is why also the whole response is about complementarity and supporting the local authority, the central government, and every capacity in place for the refugee. Not the parallel system, not duplication of effort, but putting resources where the resources are needed, and supporting the system in place that, of course, are overstretched by the numbers of refugees inside the country and all the capacity and the change. So I think this is what I wanted to share with you in a nutshell. Maybe just the word of this transition, and the next phase, it will mainly depend on what's happening in the other side of the border, and what has been mentioned by Maria and Michael also. Situation in the southwest, we have a clear impact on the Moldova refugee response, and we are prepared and preparing ourselves with the government, partner, and civil society on any type of scenario. Over to you, Dr. Hartwell. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertrand. Appreciate that very interesting overview. I think it's particularly important to understand these issues, given that the bulk of the media tend to still focus on refugees in Poland, but we don't hear much about what is going on in Moldova. But Moldova still remains very much an important place of refuge for many of these refugees who are in vulnerable positions. So let's turn again to Maria. Maria, I'm curious to know from you how this war is impacting the agricultural sector in Ukraine. And also related to this issue, we've heard a number of reports now of Russian troops stealing truckloads of Ukrainian crops and moving those trucks across the border into Russia. Can you tell us what you have witnessed, what you've heard, and how those acts are impacting on the humanitarian situation? Thank you, Maria.
Yeah, this is a great question to turn to, because this is really a pushing issue, not only for Ukraine, but for all these countries that Ukraine has been supplying grains to, because it used to be the bread basket. It was called the bread basket because Ukraine was one of the main suppliers of grain and other agricultural products to the Middle East and North Africa. And now this food crisis is facing not only Ukraine, but these countries as well. And today, the military intelligence of Ukraine has released the official report saying that they now have information about the grain and that was expropriated from the temporarily occupied territories in the south and in the east of Ukraine, was then by trucks moved to the Crimea, and now some ships are with these grains are situated in the Mediterranean Sea and go moving this grain somewhere. And also it was supplied to the territory of Russia, and that means that Russia is now deliberately using hunger as another weapon in this war. And for Ukraine, this is not new, because we have seen this happening in the 1930s when the Soviet regime created this famine, artificial hunger, expropriating the grains, and we see it now happening again. And I have seen the official order on one of the Siberian regions, Krasnoyarsk, saying that they order the troops that are now doing what they call shyly special military operation, not saying this, so not mentioning the word war in Ukraine, and they order these troops to expropriate, actually steal the grains and bring them to Siberia, because they are not able to supply these products to themselves. And this is really worrying, and especially because it is happening in the occupied territories in the south and east of Ukraine, which all the time were the main agricultural regions. And that means that not only the grain that was stored is now stolen, but the farmers will not be able to grow more in the upcoming season, because now that's the time when you would the farmers would naturally plant the new grains, and this is not happening because they cannot use the fields, because they are littered with mines and the explosives, and they cannot access to their farms. This means that there should be some international efforts in supplying this and helping Ukraine to get out of this crisis, because to double that, Russia also blockades the ports, the Ukrainian ports through which these grains were supplied previously, and this puts this issue more and more important and more threatening as what will be happening in the upcoming months, when Ukraine will be running of supplies of the grain it had previously.
Thank you, Maria. I mean, you're describing what you call a Holodomor 2.0 situation, and we're in 2022. But I think the main point that you made is that the humanitarian situation in Ukraine could become a lot more dire than what it is currently, and we should pay attention to that. Mike, I'm going to turn back to you again. You've worked in a variety of conflict zones all over the world. 25 years of experience. What is the distinct thing about this this crisis in Ukraine?
Thanks, Dr. Hartwell. I mean, before kind of getting to distinctions, I mean, it's what strikes me first, of course, is the many characteristics that are grimly familiar, right? Besiegement, indiscriminate aerial bombardment, targeting of civilian infrastructure and lives. And just from my own kind of working experience, it recalls aspects of the war in Syria, the conflict in Chechnya, rolling series of wars in the Balkans, right? So there's a lot that is sadly familiar. I think some of the things that have stood out for me so far is that, first, this is a major conflict in a country which had and retains a high degree of state capacity and market sophistication, right? So a lot of that, of course, has been disrupted by the war, but state capacity remains at a considerable level, and in some ways is more tightly coordinated than in the pre-war period. And markets, of course, have been heavily impacted, as Maria was describing in terms of the grain market, etc. But for example, this is a conflict where you're a family that's been forced to flee in Ukraine, you're internally displaced, you may be struggling to make ends meet, to buy those basic commodities, to rent a place. But an organization like Mercy Corps can put some cash in your digital wallet on your iPhone, and you can go into a store, or you can just tap it at a checkout and buy some stuff that you really need. And it's just that level of digital sophistication is there that personally I haven't worked in a context like that previously. And that's why we're emphasizing, of course, multi-purpose cash assistance, right? Because most people can access this cash assistance. They can use this cash assistance. Where we have particularly marginalized or vulnerable groups that can't use the digital wallets, we're finding other ways to reach them with cash assistance. So it's really fundamental and transformative. And as I mentioned before, I mean, the other distinct characteristic is Ukraine has a very vibrant, very active, very solid, extensive civil society, right? And there are groups, mainly in the East, that have been working humanitarian needs since the first conflict in 2014. They're relatively few in number. Everyone's energetic, committed, as again Marie was describing, kind of heartfelt commitment. But they're also overwhelmed by demand and the sheer difficulty of the operating environment in many areas. And again, that's one of the reasons why we're emphasizing meaningful and equitable partnership with Ukrainian civil society organizations across the whole regional response.
Thank you, Mike. Your answer was very brief, so I do appreciate that. So I'll take the opportunity to ask you a quick follow-up question, if you can briefly answer this. You're talking about these digital wallets. Are you and other humanitarian organizations, are you concerned about the possibility of cyber attacks that could have a major negative impact on the humanitarian situation if you make use of those digital applications in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of whole arena of risk is one of the kind of primary concerns, like day-to-day, right, including cyber threats. And it's something that the humanitarian community has done a lot of planning around and put in place, like remedial measures, risk mitigation measures, including in terms of the digital platforms we use, whether those be for cash assistance or, for example, the information management that we talked about before. So, I mean, cash assistance as a kind of humanitarian modality, right, that's been going for quite a while now. So it's actually grown quite sophisticated, not just in terms of delivery and targeting, but in terms of security. So most of the platforms that humanitarian organizations use, whether that be UNHCR, whether that be Mercy Corps, to deliver digital cash assistance are actually pretty secure. It doesn't mean there's no threat, of course. Threat is always there, but there are multiple security measures that we've put in place with our partners who help us deliver that cash assistance. So, for example, in Ukraine, we're hoping to partner with Nova Poshta to deliver cash assistance in a pilot. They have their own security measures. So there's multiple layers. So it's certainly a risk, but one that we are hopefully prepared for.
Excellent, thank you. That's really interesting. Let's turn back to Bertrand. Bertrand, how has UNHCR adapted its operation to accommodate this rapid rise of Ukrainian refugees in Moldova? And what lessons do you have for other humanitarian missions around the world?
Thank you. Maybe if you allow me just one comment to echo also what Michael Young just said about the security, because that's been also a concern in Moldova on the use of social media also to reach out of refugee, online registration. I just want to reiterate, I mean, I fully agree with what Michael Young said. There is more security system in place, of course, that will be brushed into the system. No system is unbreachable, right? But we need to work on 2021, 2022 actually time, right? So we need to work with social media, we need to work with online system, we need to work with this kind of new technology. We cannot just work as old school before and then without using all these tools for us. And I think it's making a big difference. I can see it in Moldova just by the way we can reach out the population. Let's also not forget that, all the refugee population are on Facebook, Viber, Telegram, everyone is online. So we cannot live without this and we cannot work without this. So we are fully concerned of the risk of this for hacker system, etc. And we try to secure the system, but we really need to work on this system. On your question about UNHCR scaling up in Moldova, we had no presence in Moldova just before the war. We only had one staff roving from the Budapest multi-country office. And that's all. Now we have about 100 staff. We've opened an office. We opened several warehouses in Chisinau, the capital, to stock and pre-position stocks also for in case of for the contingency plannings. We have been partnership with more than 7 organizations, including a national organization, international organizations such as Acted, Intersource, the Catholic Relief Service, and also direct partnership with the government and some ministry working on the refugee response. And we will scale up more and more in the coming weeks, given the needs of international solidarity to the government of the Republic of Moldova and the people. Like I said, a lot of volunteerism, a lot of initiative coming from everyone in the country, but that needs a lot of support from the international community, and this is part of the responsibility of Humanitarian international partner, international NGOs. All of us, we received significant funds from donors and donation private sectors to support Moldova, to support the refugee response, and this is time for us also to be complementary, support, taking over some of the activities that need to be taken over. For example, we, to the request of the government, we take over some of the call center for refugees inside Moldova. We also support warehouse management. I mean, everything, you know, it's not just about protection and direct assistance, it's also the overall system to protect and support the refugee in the country. So the scaling up has been happening and still happening. All the UN agencies, national NGO, international NGO are increasing the footprint inside Moldova. With some difficulty also, it's not easy to recruit in Moldova. You have a workforce shortage. It's also a country, like many countries in the region, that was not facing humanitarian crisis before. So you have a lot of capacity building exercise needed to you know, get the right people, the right system in place, etc. But we're going fast, and I have to say it again and acknowledge again the capacity on the ground from the Moldovan people and colleagues are amazing. So that's give me a lot of optimism actually about the scale of the response and what we can do in Moldova to protect and support the refugee response in this community. Over to you, Dr. Hartwell.
Thank you, Bertrand. Maria, let's go back to you. There's a lot of talk about what could be anticipated will happen in Kharkiv and other areas in Ukraine should the strategic southern city of Mariupol fall. So I don't know if you could maybe try and answer for us, what do you anticipate would happen in Kharkiv and some of these other areas, and especially with regards to humanitarian needs in the coming months?
So what it looks like now, the war will not be short term, and we need to be prepared for the long war. And I think that the possible scenario, as it's seen now in Ukraine, might be like living like Israel is living, in the constant understanding that the threat is very close, and anytime some kind of attack, especially in eastern Ukraine and in Kharkiv, can happen. And seeing what Putin, as you have mentioned in the beginning, in the opening remarks in his speech during the Victory Day parade, that given the so parallels between what the Russian troops are doing now and what was happening during the World War II. So he is now clearly preparing with the state propaganda the population for the long-term war and for the long-term effects of this war for the population in Russia. And we need to be prepared for that as well. Of course, we hope, or everyone here hopes that the Victory Day for Ukraine will come soon, but I think that we need to be prepared for the worst scenario as well. As for the humanitarian needs, I just have some recent numbers for Kharkiv only. And for example, just to understand the scale of the destruction, in Kharkiv, more than 3,000 residential buildings were destroyed. And by saying residential building, I mean that this is a multi-story big apartment building where lots of families, thousands of people were living, and it doesn't mean that they were destroyed completely, but it means that this number 3,000, this is all the building that needs to be repaired, rebuilt. Some of them will have to be should be rebuilt completely. Some of them are less destroyed, but still. And apart from that, the number is that the 100 schools and 90 kindergartens just in Kharkiv were heavily damaged. And this means that if even the war is over right now, this moment, the months or even years will come until everything what was destroyed by the Russian troops will be rebuilt. And the main humanitarian need will be for this, just to prepare again the housing for the people where they can return. Because I have been to the metro station in one of the mostly damaged areas called Saltivka, which before the war was 400,000 people lived there alone. And on that metro station in the underground right now, this day, 800 people are living just in the metro because their apartments are destroyed. They have nowhere to go. And all these people want some help and are looking for some help so that they will be able to move somewhere to have some place where they can normally live. And this is, I think, the biggest issue. And of course, the supplies of the basic needs, because the economy is fallen, obviously, because of the war. And the effect of the war is the long-term effect will be on the Ukrainian economy. People are not able to work, not able to get money, to earn money, and that means that their need for basic supplies will be growing, especially in the eastern Ukraine. And in all this, I think we need a very good strategy that will be developed together with our international partners, because for sure it is the challenge that Ukraine will not be able to cope with alone.
Thank you, Maria. Let me ask you on that note, what should the international community do to ease the humanitarian burden of this conflict, most importantly, in your opinion?
Well, I think that what is already being done, but just probably on a larger scale and more humanitarian need, targeted need for those people who need this help right now at this moment. Some already doing some initiatives on how to help in rebuilding and probably building something new for those people who lost their homes. And speaking about the future, the system of education must be rearranged, because Kharkiv was one of the biggest university centers in Ukraine, and now there is no possibility for students to study, for university students to go to the universities here, because they are severely damaged. So all this needs to be rearranged. So there are many spheres in which the international help is crucial. And of course, adding to this, we shall continue doing the work that was done on putting more sanctions on Russia, so the Russian government will not be able to finance the war further, because there will be no point in rebuilding this city, understanding that very soon Russian troops will again start destroying what has been built.
Thank you, Maria. Let's turn to Mike again. Mike, now what's been the spillover impact of the war in Ukraine? And how, if that's the case, has funding been and attention been drained away from some of the other humanitarian crises around the globe?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Hartwell. So I guess that the main thing to highlight there is that Ukraine crisis exists within a world in crisis, right? So you're thinking Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Myanmar, the Horn of Africa, etc., etc. Sadly, that's a long list. And we are already seeing key international aid system donors shift resources from those crises to fund their responses to the war in Ukraine. I guess the kind of crudely put, the message must be, don't rob all those Peters to pay Pavlo, right? I mean, the Ukraine crisis needs to be funded at an appropriate level, and as Maria pointed out, that is going to be significant over a protracted period of time. But it can't be at the expense of other crises, other humanitarian needs. In the UK, where the US LSE is based, seeing the aid budget slashed from 0.7% to 0.5%, and we're already seeing diversion of those already constrained resources from other crises, from funding in other crises to fund programs for Ukraine. And the UK government says that aid cut is temporary, right? So if there was ever a time for the UK government and a solid justification for restoring the 0.7% cap and releasing more of that aid money into the system, it's now. with Ukraine on top of everything else. So it is time to level it up, I think, in the UK.
Thank you, Mike. Another brief question from one of our audience members. What can volunteers do to help Ukrainians at this point from this humanitarian perspective? Which NGOs or organizations need more people to help? And I think you can also take some liberties and maybe speak to if there are, say, for example, Brits wanting to go to Ukraine to volunteer, if that is even possible.
Sorry, is that a question to me again?
Yeah, Mike, that's to you.
Okay. So, I mean, Mexico is not an organization that uses a lot of volunteers, particularly not in conflict zones for obvious reasons. So we don't have a great depth of expertise to speak from, right? One thing is true, and it may be not something that people necessarily want to hear, is that the single most effective thing that people can do to assist people in Ukraine is give cash, right? Give cash to aid organizations, give cash to local groups that Maria was talking about. And that cash immediately hits the bloodstream of the aid operation and can be translated into solid humanitarian assistance on the ground.
Thank you, Mike. All right, let's go to Bertrand, to you again. So Moldova is a relatively poor country with a GDP of nearly $12 billion and a GDP per capita of about $4,500 compared to the EU's average GDP of about $35,000. What has been the impact of refugees on Moldovan society, and what is UNHCR doing to alleviate the burden on Moldova?
Thank you. No, the impact, like you mentioned, the impact on the society, it's on the whole society in Moldova, it's quite significant. But that's also linked to additional structural problems that the country faces, like many countries in the world, particularly the energy crisis and a very high inflation rate in the country right away, which has nothing to do with the refugee influx, right? But cumulative, it's a lot of issues that the government and the society have to face right now in the country, and many more resources are to require to support Moldova. But outside of the humanitarian scopes, it's not about humanitarian. We're talking about major development donors, EU assistance, World Bank engagement. UNHCR have been working with the World Bank, for example, to support the Moldova authorities and countries. There is several initiatives going on with the European Union also on direct support with the Moldova, and this is the kind of support that the country will require now and needs, and has been quite clear actually. All the President, Prime Minister has been vocal on this issue, that yes, assistance is needed for refugee response, but we also need assistance to face the gas crisis, to face the economic crisis, to face food and security, etc. So again, humanitarian organization cannot address this kind of issue. We can just alleviate some of the burden, support on the humanitarian response. You probably know that we've launched a refugee response plan 2 weeks ago. Was covering all the receiving refugee from Ukraine, and just the chapter for Moldova, it's more than $400 million request for 40 partners in the country. So that's also a significant effort that we are asking to the donor communities to support Moldova as a country and as a first respondent for this refugee crisis. Over to you, Dr. Hartwell.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to all our speakers for bringing to the table your expertise and telling us a little bit about the needs. I think you've given us a good overview of what's to come. I think even if the war stops today, there's still going to be a massive humanitarian crisis ahead that we need to anticipate. I would also like to remind our audience that we have our LSE Student Union set up a fund for Ukrainian refugees. If you would like to support that, I think we've dropped a link in the chat section. And so I just want to thank all our panelists, and maybe Maria, if you want to take a few seconds just to have the final word, I'll give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for supporting Ukraine, because this war that is waged by Putin, this is not the war against only Ukraine. This is the war against democracy, against freedom, against the free will And by standing with Ukraine and by speaking about this and by bringing up these vital issues to the discussion, you help a lot to my country, and we appreciate here this help a lot. And I'm sure that there is no other option for Ukraine and for all the countries that support us to win in this war. And I think that the victory is close, and all together we will, go to the brighter and future, a safer future for everyone. And I think that this war will change the everything. It has already changed, and we will then be in need of creating some new world order, if it's not too big to say, because as it has happened after the last World War II, and I think that all these intellectuals efforts like you and LSE are doing will be really necessary in doing this, in creating the new structures, because that we will need them for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for your participation. Mike, Bertrand, thank you so much. Good luck with your work, and thank you to your missions also for the good work that you're doing. Goodbye, everyone, and good luck.